Western values and life as we know it are threatened by waves of Muslim immigrants who don't want to integrate into our society and are loyal only to Islam. Two of many myths our first guest says are simply not true. Here's Doug Saunders, international affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail and the author of The Myth of the Muslim Tide: Do Immigrants Threaten the West? Doug, it's good to see you again. Welcome back to TVO.
Yeah.
We had you last year with A Rival City, and now you've arrived back for your next book.
That's right.
I want to start by just laying out a bit of a checklist here, and then we'll go into our interview after that. Here are the Doug Saunders years in Europe. November 2004, Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh is assassinated for making a film criticizing women in Islam. July 2005, the London subway bombings. September 2005, Jyllands-Posten, a Danish newspaper, publishes 12 cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. November 2009, the Swiss vote to ban construction of new minarets. September 2010, the French Parliament bans the wearing of the niqab in public places. July 2011, Norwegian Anders Breivik bombs an Oslo government building and kills 69 people on Utoya Island. And finally, March 2012, a French-Algerian Islamist kills 4 outside a Jewish school in Toulouse, France. All these events leading to heightened ethnic and religious tensions in Europe. Let's go back to the beginning here. What exactly, in your view, do some people in the West fear when it comes to Muslim immigration?
I think a lot of reasonable liberal people have had worries about their new neighbors. There has been Muslim immigration from Muslim majority countries on reasonably high levels since around 1990. By far not the largest group in almost every European country, but the most visible group and controversial group. They cover their heads, they wear beards, that sort of thing. And at the same time as that's occurred, there has been a political extremist movement carrying out serious crimes of terrorism, both in the Muslim world and in Western countries. I think it's quite reasonable that people would have worries about the connection, whether they look at their neighbors and say, do these people share my values? Are they supporting these crimes?
That checklist I just went through, how many of those did you actually live in that location when those happened?
I found myself, I was in London during the July 7th subway attacks, and one of my neighbors lost both her legs in that. I was in the south of France during the Toulouse shootings. I was in Oslo, Norway the day after Anders Breivik's killing spree. In fact, I was living in the United States during September 11th. So I've certainly felt the fear, and I began this investigation not as somebody who wanted to denounce people who had worries about Muslim immigration as racists or bigots or intolerant people, but understanding them as people like me who had legitimate questions.
Well, let me read a chapter, not a chapter, a little excerpt from your book here. This is right here from the beginning of the book, amplifying what you just said, since you were on the ground at the scene for many of those tragedies. About 15 years ago, you wrote, my London neighborhood began to change. We noticed it first among the crowds on our rough and tumble shopping street, Holloway Road, where there were suddenly a lot more women with covered heads. Some wore a colorful hijab, others the white veil popular among East Africans, still others the heavy black chador, and occasionally by the bus shelter a pair of eyes would peer from a narrow slit in the all-concealing black sack of a Saudi-style abaya and niqab. Whatever their headdress, these women tended to have a lot of children with them. Then the street itself changed. Its procession of pubs and corner stores was joined by a great many Turkish eateries, some of them excellent, along with several grotty internet cafes and money transfer shops with opaque Arabic signs. Within a few years, it felt as if Islam was closing in. My question is, did that make you uncomfortable, watching that transpire?
I can't say it didn't entirely. And I say this as both as a person who has always lived in heavy immigrant neighborhoods in Toronto and Los Angeles and then in London, and as a person who's spent a lot of time in Muslim countries, in Iran, in the Indian subcontinent, in North Africa, and so on.
But what's your concern? These people may not be like me after all?
Sure. I mean, our local mosque for a while had an extremist imam. There were terrorist attacks carried out by the British-born children of immigrants. I had every reason to worry and suspect my neighbors, even if one of them was my doctor and one of them, they were all my shopkeepers and my kids' friends and so on. And I thought, okay, if I'm worried, then other people must be. And there's the worry of the liberal, the worry that your tolerance and liberalism and respect for secular institutions and equality and so on is going to be challenged by a group of immigrants who have fundamental values that are opposed to those things, that are intolerant and so on. And I spent some time looking into that. And I spent some time in the neighborhoods where people were moving from Morocco and Turkey and Pakistan.
Okay, follow up on that. From your vantage point, what was everyday existence for Muslims like in your neck of the woods?
It was the immigrants' existence. It was trying to buy a house, trying to start a shop, trying to get your children into university. It was the struggle of the new immigrant from a relatively poor country. And I knew other parts of London that had been scary and extreme and criminal earlier, East London, and Brick Lane, and so on. In the 1980s was the scenes of riots among Bangladeshi immigrants, of drug crime and that sort of thing. And that somehow turned itself around. It became the place where everybody wanted to go. They became the integration success story. It was the communities of Pakistanis and Bangladeshis who'd moved in there, who became the university professors and business people and the chairwoman of the British Conservative Party and things like this.
Well, let's be clear about this here, because I want to know, are you arguing that Muslim immigration to Western countries has not posed any particular challenge to those countries?
A challenge, yes. The challenge of religious minority immigrants is not nothing. I'm not saying that it's a myth that immigration is difficult. Immigration requires work to make it work. An investment up front, as I wrote in my previous book, Arrival City, can create great returns later on down the road. A lot of the countries that I was visiting and living in weren't making those investments. They were forcing people into, shunting them into off to the side and not allowing them full citizenship and so on. And what I realized was that people coming from some of these countries were moving to one place in Europe and becoming very successful, middle-class, educated, integrated people, and we're moving to other places and becoming ghettoized, conservative, poor, troubled people. And if that was the case, if they could integrate well in the United States and in parts of London and so on, coming from the same villages that they were integrating poorly if they were going to, say, Berlin, that meant it couldn't be the culture they were coming from. That meant it wasn't the religion that was doing it. That meant there was something else having to do with their surroundings around them.
Well, let's go through some of these in the book. You call it the myth of the Muslim tide. And here are what, in your view, are some of the common misconceptions over Muslim immigration. Let's go through them, and I'll get your views on this. Muslims will become the majority in Europe sometime during the 21st century. That's what a lot of people think. What do the facts say?
That's at the root of a lot of these things. That's one thing that is unquestionably not based on truth. The population growth of Muslim immigrants is converging very quickly with that of the societies around them. At most, a couple European countries could have close to 10% Muslim populations by the middle of this century, but at that point peaking. The United States, maybe 2%. Canada, probably peaking somewhere just above 6%, and so on.
The anecdotal evidence, though, that you hear people talking about suggests that Muslims have a lot of kids, and that they will be the majority at some point soon. How can you be sure that that's not going to happen?
Two things. First of all, the countries they're coming from are seeing the fastest falling birth rates in the world. Iran went from 7 children per family in the 1980s to 1.7 now, lower than France or Britain. And other countries like United Arab Emirates and Lebanon and Turkey and Bangladesh have seen similar dramatic falls. And immigrants have most of their kids after arriving. This was true of Roman Catholics, Eastern European Jews, Sikhs, so on. Generally, you have a lot of kids after you arrive. Your children have far fewer kids. Their children generally have the same number of kids as everyone else around them.
Okay, issue 2. Muslim immigrants are guided by a religion which is more ideology than spiritual faith. Yes or no?
No. And I'm not saying that because I'm looking at the scripture and reading the Quran or anything, because if you read the holy books of the three Abrahamic religions, you would become convinced that they are all extremist and dangerous if you took those words literally, and if any believer did. So the question I'm looking at is not what's in the holy books or what are the radical imams saying. It's what are people actually doing? Are they displaying a loyalty to the religion and so on? And Muslim immigrants tend to fall to the level of religiosity of the society around them. Muslims who go to France, a fifth of them become atheist and only 5% of them attend a mosque. Muslims who come to the United States, about half of them worship every Friday, which is exactly the same rate as devout Christians and so on. So generally, and their loyalty to the civil institutions tends to be, if anything, somewhat higher than among non-Muslims. There tends to be a sort of gratefulness at having arrived. Are there exceptions? Sure, but generally speaking, the Muslim immigrant is not being guided by the religious teachings, is not following them.
Issue 3, Muslims are on the side of terrorists. Yes or no?
The support for the types of violence that are committed by terrorists is lower among Muslims than among non-Muslims. There's a study that gets thrown around quite a lot in these books and blog postings and so on, saying that 7% of US Muslims say they support violence against civilians if the cause is right, which, to be frank, alarmed me when I heard that, until I actually looked at the study, which showed that 24% of non-Muslim Americans support attacks against civilians if the cause is right. We should be asking ourselves why so many fewer Muslims and non-Muslims are supporting this type of violence, probably because they're the main victims of this type of violence.
Issue 4, Muslims want to set up Sharia law in the West. Yes or no?
Not as a national law. There is no movement to establish Sharia law. The Islamic terrorist groups are not fighting to establish Sharia law, even they're fighting to protect what they see as their civilizational territory. There have been, however, efforts to form Islamic tribunals governed by the churches to govern weddings and divorces and so on, most famously in Ontario. And that's a result of the fact that in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of governments went to alternative dispute resolution, where they allowed outside arbitrators to settle things without a court trial, and they allowed Roman Catholics and Jews to have religious leaders settle these type of disputes. And in the 80s, both in Britain and in Ontario, Muslim groups said, if the two other faiths that share this God can have their religious leaders decide these things, why can't we? And I've got to credit Premier Dalton McGuinty with coming up with a reasonable solution to this after there was a lot of outcry, both from people who were afraid of Muslims and from a lot of secular Muslims who didn't like religious leaders imposing these things. He said, okay, let's be done with it. Let's not have religious tribunals decided by Muslim, Jewish, or Christian leaders. Let's keep these decisions secular. And that was a respectable decision. In Britain, they decided, no, let's just let all religions, if they wish, have their private tribunals. Both are good decisions. And I think one of the benefits almost of the hysteria around Muslim immigration is that it's made us confront the degree to which religion has made incursions into civil society.
Okay, let's ask one more question then, and we'll invite the others to join us for our debate. When Catholics and Jews immigrated to the New World, the tendency was for those communities to embrace the values and the views of the new host country, if you like.
Eventually.
Eventually.
Although not as quickly as you think. It took 2 or 3 generations.
Okay, well, you know that the fear, I guess, or the suspicion is that that doesn't happen with Muslim immigrants. You've looked at it. What's the truth?
That's the most fascinating thing, is that we tend to forget our own history. And we tend to forget when very large numbers of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe arrived in North America and in Britain, and when a lot of Southern European Roman Catholics arrived, they both had the same integration picture and challenges and so on that we see now with Muslims. In fact, maybe taking even a bit longer because it was a less connected world. There was if anything, a bigger civilizational difference, you could say. And the response from ordinary people and from politicians, not all, there was a lot of tolerance, but there was also pockets of intolerance, pockets of people saying, these Roman Catholics from Italy and Portugal are not so much members of a religion as members of an ideology of conquest. Mm-hmm. They are having huge families. They're going to take over. They're going to become a majority. They're sending their kids to segregated schools. They're self-ghettoizing. The countries they come from are extremist and subject to fascism, and they tend to form organized crime gangs. Therefore, they are a threat to our civilization and to our Western values. And there was enough evidence around to make it look that way to people who felt like believing this at the time. It took really until the 1960s before it was unacceptable to say these things in public about Catholics and Jews.
I know you've presented the case in this book that all of what the traditional fears are about Muslim immigration aren't true. But lots of people still believe them because it has the ring of truth to it, or they've seen in their own daily lives examples of that which you say just isn't the case. How do you make the case that they're wrong and you're right?
We've spent a decade during which people have been looking for answers to these questions of my new neighbors, they look different, and they're members of a religion to which a group of criminals and terrorists claim adherence. And is there a connection? And there's been a long string of popular books and YouTube videos and articles and so on saying, yes, there is a connection. Yes, there is a continuous line of belief between the moderate, ordinary Muslim and the extremist. Yes, it's not so much a religion as an ideology of conquest and so on. I say you need to look at the facts. You need to look at what's happening. You don't need to pretend that everything's well. You don't need to pretend that Islam is a religion of love or something like that. I'm not a religious person. I don't particularly have any interest in religion, and I don't want to see more of it around me.
But just look at the numbers, you say.
Well, look at the facts, and I'm happy to present the facts that do not conveniently. So there are pockets of failed integration. There are problems with the children of Muslim immigrants being prone to anti-Semitism, with young males from some Muslim cultures being highly prone to dropping out of high school at a young age.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.